Hello, my name is Crystal Dahl, and I'm the Online Communications Manager here at Meritas. I would like to welcome and thank each of you for joining us on today's webinar, Renegotiating NAFTA, What's on the Table. For those of you new to Meritas, Meritas is an established global alliance of closely connected yet independent law firms that each offer a full range of high-quality, specialized legal services. We were built upon a rigorous system for monitoring and enhancing the quality of our member firms and have been connecting clients with carefully qualified business legal expertise in 240 markets around the world since 1990. Meritas capability webinars are regularly presented by Meritas members. Before we get started, I would like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items. Meritas offers the ability to listen to our webinars through your computer speakers. If at any time you have any difficulty hearing the presentation, you may call into the associated telephone line instead. All phone lines will be muted. If you experience any technical difficulties, please press *0 at any time to connect with a support technician. Since you will be muted, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask via the chat feature found on the left-hand side of your screen. The presenters plan to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Lastly, in the next few days, I will distribute a copy of the presentation, a recording of the webinar, as well as each of the presenters' contact details. I have the pleasure today of introducing Hugo Cuesta, Didier Coulat, and Brian Walsh. Hugo is with our Meritas member firm in Mexico, Cuesta Campos. He has acted as lead Mexican counsel in several international projects and business transactions, advising multinationals on their legal, corporate, and finance structure in Mexico, as well as in a number of public bidding processes with the Mexican government. He is vice chair and board member of Meritas Law Firms and former vice chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Mexico. He is also a member of the New York State Bar Association as part of the Latin American Council of their International Section and of the Anti-Corruption Committee of the IBA. He also serves as member of the board of various multinationals, the Chamber of Commerce, and various foundations and nonprofit organizations. He teaches the class of ethical standards in the legal profession at the prestigious Universidad Panamericana. Mr. Cuesta is part of a group of advisors closely related to the Next Door Room advising the Mexican negotiations of NAFTA. Didier comes to us from our Meritas member firm in Quebec, Canada, BCF. He has acted in financing transactions with international cross-border implications and in securities law. He has particular experience in cross-border transactions and the implementation of wholesale and resale financing programs for financial institutions. Mr. Coulat also frequently assists other Canadian and foreign law firms in their commercial or securities work in the province of Quebec. He has lectured and written for an audience outside of Canada on doing business in Quebec as well. We also have the pleasure of hearing from Brian Walsh today. Brian Walsh is a partner in the Chicago office of Barnes, Richardson & Colburn, a Meritas member firm which limits its practice to the areas of U.S. Customs, export control, and international trade law. Since the implementation of the NAFTA, Mr. Walsh has been actively involved in advising companies on NAFTA compliance, including whether goods traded within the NAFTA region qualify for preferential treatment under the NAFTA rules of origin, representing companies in NAFTA origin verifications, audits, and investigations, and filing numerous prior disclosures to protect companies from the potential assessments of penalties in cases in which preferential treatment was mistakenly or incorrectly claimed. He argued before the second binational panel, governed under the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which was the predecessor of the NAFTA. His practice has also involved significant compliance issues involving many other of the free trade agreements to which the United States is a party. Welcome, gentlemen. We definitely have a broad amount of expertise here. With that, Hugo, are you ready to get started?
Yes, I am.
All right, take it away.
Thank you. Brian, can we move into the next slide, please?
Yes.
Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar where we will be discussing the very hot topic of NAFTA, which as you know, it's been on the news everywhere. And I'll have to admit that the three presenters today have been having the challenge of gathering information and data from a moving target. And to give you an example, yesterday the second round of negotiations ended here in Mexico City, actually in a hotel a few blocks from our office. And we have been gathering information on what happened on this second round of negotiations. And let me start by sharing with you a few pieces of data which show the relevance of NAFTA not only for this part of the world, but in general for the world trade. Let's keep in mind that the market of NAFTA is composed by 485 million people. Just as a comparison, the European Union is composed by 509 million people. And the NAFTA market represents 17% of the trade of goods in the world. And not only that, but 20% of the world's GDP, which is equal to $22 trillion. In terms of the scope and the purposes of the topics that we will cover on this webinar, clearly there are some objectives and priorities of each of the countries and of each of the countries' negotiating teams. There are some strategies that we have seen along the way, and I'm sure that many of you have seen the strategies that some of the countries have used in this process. And a lot has been written and said from various sources on this. The media has said many things. In fact, some of the information that has been shared in the media has been conflicting information. But not only that, I'm sure that a number of the participants on this webinar are also very well aware of the tweeters that have been issued in connection with the negotiation of NAFTA and on the relationship among the three countries. And there's another very important source of information, which is the one that I have the privilege of being close to, which is what we call the next door room. The next door room, and I was asking Brian and Didier what the exact translation for this was, but basically it's the group of advisors that are coming along with the negotiators. It's expected to be approximately a number of 100 people belonging to trade industries, to chambers of commerce of the various industries that are advising the negotiating team of each of the countries. In fact, I mean, as a piece of information, yesterday I was at the hotel where the negotiations were being held, and I met with a number of members of the next door room, and actually I saw the media there in the corridors, I would say like sharks chasing information, and I could see that they were not very successful because most of the negotiators entered and left the rooms through the back door. So many of the things that I read this morning on the news, I actually know was the fact that did not happen exactly the way they say, but the media has not had the access that they have expected as a result of the confidentiality agreements that all of the members of the negotiation teams have encountered. Obviously, Brian and Didier will present their views from the U.S. and Canadian perspective regarding trade deficit, regarding politics and trade, and we will also discuss some of the deal breakers that have been discussed in this process. And with this, Brian, I will ask you to move to the next slide to continue sharing with the group the relevance of the NAFTA facts. I mean, when I see these numbers, which I share with you, 1 million people and 370,000 vehicles crossing the border legally every day, and I'm talking only the border between the U.S. and Mexico. Obviously, the ones that cross illegally are not here, and you can speculate as much as you want as to how will that number add up and increase the 1 million people that cross the border. The trade between Mexico and the U.S. is approximately $1 million a minute. What I used to do when I explained this in a number of presentations, because as I said, this has been a pretty hot topic lately, is that the trade among the NAFTA members is like a train going at 500 miles an hour. And the question is, do we really want to stop this? I mean, and can it be stopped? And this is something that has been said on the news also, that one of the main reasons why the United States wants to renegotiate NAFTA is because it has lost a significant number of jobs to Mexico. But if you read these statistics that come from very reliable sources, it is expected that 14 million jobs in the U.S. are created as a result of the trade that the U.S. has with Canada and Mexico. And obviously, needless to say, is how important the U.S. and Canada are for Mexico as among our most important trade partners, but the relevance of Mexico, particularly with NAFTA, is also very significant because we are the first and second purchaser of 29 of the 50 states of of the United States, and we are the third largest partner of the U.S. And if we move on, Brian, to the next slide, let me share with you a couple of additional information from the Mexican perspective, and then I promise that I will pass it on to Brian and Didier because I know I'm expanding a little bit the minutes I was given to. The Mexican team is approaching this negotiation with a clear win-win mentality. And the main focus of everyone that I have spoken with that belong to the next door room that are advising the negotiators is that the final goal is to strengthen the NAFTA region. I would have to admit that I am particularly very happy with the negotiation team that has been gathered among the government officials, including the Ministry of Economy, the private sector and industry. And this is one of the unusual times in Mexico where we have seen the government and the private sector united, aligned, and having selected very professional and competent members. As an example of the lack of information that the media has been able to share, they have been coming up with information, ridiculous information sometimes, and let me give you an example of this. Since Mexico has a Mr. Baker, which is our Vice Ministry of Commerce, and a Mr. Smith, which is a Chief of Negotiation, some of the Mexican newspapers have shared information that these guys have been infiltrated by the Americans on the Mexican team, which are obviously ridiculous because Mr. Smith is Mr. Smith Ramos and has been representing the interest of Mexico on a number of negotiations in the past. And with this, I will pass it on to Brian on the next slide.
Thank you, Hugo. Let's see as soon as this advances. So from the U.S. side, I'd have to say that things look much different in terms of what was just mentioned, coordination between industry and government and transparency. On the U.S. side, the approach has been much different. I think everyone's aware of the continued threats to withdraw from NAFTA, even as recently as last week, and then towards the end of the week and into the weekend, we were anticipating perhaps withdrawal from the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement as well as a possibility, although it seems that we've moved back from the precipice on that. The goal of the United States in these negotiations, and there is a publication by the United States Trade Representative that spells out specifically what the goals are. And the number one goal is to improve the U.S. trade balance and reduce the trade deficit with NAFTA countries. There are a number of other more technical goals, but that's number one. And I think later in the presentation we'll be talking about what those trade deficit numbers actually look like. But my observation and what I've been hearing in terms of the way that negotiations have been going, and I'll be interested, Hugo, in hearing what you have to say, having been down the hall from the negotiations. But my understanding has been that the most difficult issues, such as rules of origin and other of the most contentious issues, really remain to be addressed. And it makes me think a little bit about using an analogy to a real estate negotiation strategy, where the party that's willing to walk away from the table is left in the most advantageous position. And I think that may be part of the negotiating strategy to leave some of those most difficult issues to the end to bring things to a head, I'm afraid. And I also have to point to what seems to be, in many cases, a disconnect between the goals of negotiation and industry and perhaps Congress. because we have many different industry organizations and groups that oppose tightening the rules of origin and oppose tightening the requirements for obtaining preferential treatment, when that is the actual goal of negotiation that is being put forth by the government, including going as so far as to requiring not only specific content from within the NAFTA region, but perhaps specific content between individual NAFTA members. So specifying, for instance, X% content in the auto area for U.S. content as opposed to partner member content. So with that, I'll pass it on to Didier.
Yes, thanks, Brian. At the Canadian government, mid-August, published its priorities for the NAFTA negotiations, and just to really run through them quickly was they wanted a new chapter on labor standards, a new chapter on environmental standards, a new chapter on gender rights, on indigenous rights. It was willing to reform the investor-state dispute settlement process under Chapter 11. It wanted to expand procurement to annul the effects of the Buy America and the Buy American rules. And it wanted a freer movement of professionals to expand the class that's already under NAFTA. It wanted to protect Canada's supply management system for dairy and poultry. Wanted to protect the cultural exemptions that exist. And it wanted to maintain what is Chapter 19, which is a process to regulate anti-dumping countervailing disputes, by what are commonly known as the dispute resolution panels, as similar to what is under the World Trade Organization mechanisms. So those are the stated goals, and I have to agree with Brian and Hugo that right now the work is being concentrated on the easy stuff, and that the more difficult questions have been pushed off to a later time. So as much as Brian talks about a real estate deal, I'm going to talk about a labor relations deal, where you don't talk about salary till you get to the end, and you settle all the easy non-contentious issues at the beginning. So at least there is a corpus of agreement amongst the parties. So those are the stated priorities, and I think that there are kind of like two precedents out there of ready-made concessions that are guiding the parties, and they are those that were made under the draft Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and by Canada under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union. So there have been concessions. This agreement, NAFTA, is now 23 years old, and it needs to be freshened up given the current economic environment, including clauses for electronic commerce, for example. So that's the Canadian perspective on those issues. I don't know if there was anything that I can add at this point of our conversation.
Yeah. No, and in connection with what Brian and Didier has said, from the Mexico perspective, it is also perceived that the toughest part of the negotiation are not being addressed at these early stages on this round 1 and 2. Actually, some of the next door room members expect, Didier, a much tougher third round in Canada, which is, I understand, on the 25th of September. And one of the things that I have seen or heard that is present on every table that has met is the trade deficit, particularly the trade deficit between Mexico and the U.S. But one of the things is that we need to analyze how is this trade deficit calculated from the U.S. perspective. The deficit is calculated, as you can see on the table, in billions of dollars. And if you compare the trade deficit that the U.S. has with China as the one it has with Mexico. Mexico is only the fourth in terms of trade deficit. However, there are significant pitfalls that we believe that the U.S. Department of Commerce is falling into in the calculation of this trade deficit, which are very important to be kept in mind. Two examples. 40% of the Mexican exports to the U.S. has a U.S. content. And this alone, in my view, would be a big player and would have a significant impact on the $63 billion that the U.S. Department of Commerce consider that the U.S. has with Mexico in terms of trade. And something else which is not considered, which is a huge amount, are the profits of U.S. companies operating in Mexico. And you can think, for example, on Citibank. For Citibank, Mexico is like the jewel of the crown. I mean, they are very, very profitable in Mexico. Where do this profit end up? I mean, they end up, and obviously it's a public company, but in the U.S., a very significant number of this. Let me give you another example. Some of you might remember, Brian, I know you were there, when I presented in Washington at the annual meeting along with a member of the Ways and Means Committee, and I share this information. She admitted that she didn't know this, that on the calculation that the U.S. Department of Commerce that they're doing on the trade deficit, these very significant numbers are not being taken into consideration, which is, in my view, pretty relevant to consider to have an accurate amount. And with this, I'll pass it on to Didier on slide number 6, Brian.
So, and similarly, if you look at NAFTA has been an incredible relationship between Canada and the United States. The growth of trade between the two in 1990 was $174 billion, and has grown in 2012 to $617 billion. And I use the 2012 number. I'll update that to 2016 briefly, but I also want to draw out the attention that $82 billion of that is energy. Now, when Ronald Reagan started the free trade agreement negotiations with Canada in the mid-'80s, the stated goal of the United States was to secure access to Canadian energy. And today, and this is perhaps a little known fact, but Canada is the largest energy supplier of the United States. And in that context, $82 billion in 2012 was energy products. So if you actually take the energy part out of the formula, the trading goods for the United States is in a surplus position when it comes to Canada. If we could go to the next slide, Brian. This slide really illustrates that growth. You'll see that how the bilateral trade has grown. They talk about threefold since 1990, but in fact, what it is you have to take inflation out of it, and it's about 100% growth of net change. So over the 22 years of this graph, that's about a 5% increase per year, and energy is a huge player in that. You see that in the composition of the trade of goods on the next slide, Brian. Where you see the breakup, and you see that by 26% of all exports to the United States from Canada is oil and gas. There's another $2 billion that is added to that, which is electricity. And you see that transportation equipment bilaterally, which is a code name for the automobile industry, is second in terms of trade. And on the next slide, I kind of actualize the information from 2012 through today, where you see that the bilateral relationship in U.S. dollars is $631 billion today. 76 billion of that is energy. oil, gas, and electricity. And so when you read that into the numbers, here again you see that there is a surplus of goods that are being exported to Canada from the United States. So, the current and I did the same analysis on the next slide for the relationship with Canada and Mexico. The numbers are smaller, but the total trade is 40 billion and largely deficitatory with Mexico. And I would surmise that distance has probably a factor to do with that. But all this to say that the political discourse that's out there is that this is the worst deal ever, I think it's been hugely beneficial to the United States because it's fulfilled the stated goals of Ronald Reagan, which was secure an energy source and promote trade between the two countries, and the United States has secured that energy source. It's fluctuating. It's dropping these last few years, and that's just the effect of the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota that have come up to full production. But also the more efficient fuel for vehicles that were brought in under the Obama administration. But all this to say is that trade deficit. What trade deficit? Is what I would say if I was talking to someone in the White House.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Didier. Well, I imagine that you would be interested, Brian, in replicating what the U.S. has stand to lose after this very interesting comments from Didier.
Yes, I would. I'd have to say, Hugo, that the numbers that the USTR has put out, which we shared with regard to the trade deficit in between the United States and Mexico, mirror what you have put forth here in terms of, for instance, in 2016, $63.2 billion. And when you were talking about the fact that the U.S. content in those goods being returned to the United States isn't counted in that, it did make me think, though, that that balance, that trade deficit, is a factor of imports in the United States over exports to Mexico, and that U.S. content would be counted in the exports.
Okay.
It would result in an overstatement of the import value, but it would be in showing up in the equation as on the export side from the U.S.
Okay.
And then.
So what you're saying is that basically you believe that the numbers of the U.S. Department of Commerce are accurate the way they are presented.
I think that's overstating what I would say.
Okay.
I think, in fact, I think that all trade statistics are very difficult to say how accurate they are. But I did want to point out that effect that the value of the U.S. content at least does show up in a denominator of the
as an export
of the equation as an export. So it certainly is an overstatement coming back into the U.S. If you look at the imports, it's an overstatement of the Mexican added value in terms of components and labor and so forth. It's an overstatement of that. But the value of the U.S. components would be taken into account in that southbound transaction showing the exports to the U.S. But the fact of the matter is...
Yeah, I believe that at the end of the day, you're right, Brian. I mean, it depends on what the method for calculation you use, what the outcome of the deficit will result. I mean, I fully agree with you.
Yes, but I personally think that there's too much emphasis being put on the trade deficit between the United States and the other NAFTA partners. I don't think that the benefits of the agreement are given their full value in that sort of comparison. Because I think actually over the course of the agreement, if it had not been in place, I think that more jobs and more manufacturing in the United States would have been lost. Because over that same period of time, we saw the growth in manufacturing in the Far East, in China, and the transfer of plant and equipment there. And we've talked about this before. I mean, our experience in dealing with companies that are going through that process of offshoring, we see a plant going to Mexico or Canada, or an investment in Mexico or Canada, and we see parts and components manufacturing remaining in the United States, design remaining in the United States, very significant elements of value that are crossing borders between the U.S. and Mexico, the U.S. and Canada. When we see that same production go to the Far East, go to China, the suppliers move with them. That supply chain is gone. It goes to China. It goes to the Far East. And there are requirements on intellectual property sharing and so forth, and you end up losing much more. And I think that the comparison, the actual competition that's been taking place over these many years has not been between the U.S. and Mexico, or the U.S. or Canada. It's been between the Far East and the North American market. And I think that's lost in the debate about NAFTA.
Yes, absolutely. And one additional question that comes up to mind every time the trade deficit is discussed. Considering that the trade deficit of the U.S., the largest by far, is with China, is it being somehow addressed by the U.S. government, Brian?
Well, there are many, many anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases that have been filed against China. The entire steel industry has been subject to that, and we have now 2 national security investigations going on for the steel industry and for the aluminum industry, where they're actually looking at whether imports, particularly from China, affect the national security of the United States, because sourcing is not possible from other locations due to the incredible oversupply of those materials in the Chinese market. So those are going on, and then we had, of course, the threats to take action against China as a currency manipulator, which did not happen. But it's mainly been through those trade cases, through the anti-dumping countervailing duty and the 232 cases.
Okay, and in terms of what is your view as to what the U.S. would stand to lose if NAFTA goes south?
Well, are we jumping to worst case scenarios now?
No, it's on your slide, which is NAFTA, what we stand to lose.
Yeah, well, it's billions and billions of dollars of investment that have been put into the supply chain and production investment based on the patterns of trade in the North American region, which would, if changed, disrupt essentially 3 entire economies. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that there would be a dramatic loss of competitiveness and capabilities to Asia, particularly China, which, as you pointed out, 60% of the trade deficit of the United States is with China. And, I mean, some of the benefits that we've seen that people don't realize is, and as you already pointed out, the U.S. content of vehicles from Mexico before NAFTA was at a 5% level, whereas these days we're looking at the U.S. content of vehicles being imported from NAFTA at a level of 40%.
Yeah. Yeah, and in that line, Brian, if you move on to the next slide, we all have heard that at least from our perspective, and I'm speaking from the Mexican perspective, Brian described the negotiation strategy as a real estate deal, and Didier described the strategy as a labor deal where salary is discussed at the end. But from our perspective, the strategy that the U.S. has used to negotiate NAFTA has had a number of different tones, if you would. Starting from threats to withdraw the negotiation and to bring in some politics into the table. And particularly, this has been communicated, if you would, through Twitter, as we all are aware. And one of the official communications that I would like to share with you that the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who he shared last week, particularly last week, is very clear and I believe very self-descriptive of how serious and respectful and professional the Mexican authorities have approached this with. And I tell you, I'm not typically a fan of the Mexican government, but I am on this one because I believe that they're doing things right. And if you see the first statement that they made is a very strong and clear one. I believe that it leaves no room for any doubt, which says Mexico will not pay under any circumstance for the wall. I mean, there's a lot that has been said on the media around the world, but this is the official position of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And also, as I was saying earlier, on what the priorities of the Mexico negotiation team has been, is to put the Mexico's interests first, but always under a win-win approach. We are firm believers that we can compete more efficiently with the world as a region. And if we withdraw from this agreement, we will fall back on WTO rules and other things that I will discuss later, but we will lose a significant competitive advantage as a region. And the last message, which I believe is very interesting and very clear, is that the Mexican government will only negotiate through official channels and not through social media. And this has a lot to do with what Lighthizer, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it well, said this morning in a communication at the end of the negotiation round yesterday. He not only promised to continue the negotiation, he also said that he nor his team will not approve anything that President Trump does not approve, but at the same time he admitted to have created an excellent relationship among friends. That's how he has described the negotiation. And one of the things that we are particularly happy with in Mexico, and this speaks very well of the three negotiating teams, is the accelerated process that they have used on the negotiation. And there are firm expectations to conclude with this process this year, which is particularly relevant for Mexico because we have elections for president next year. And the worst thing that can happen on NAFTA, I believe, is to analyze it outside of the specific trade perspective and to politicize it. This, in Latin America and I believe everywhere in the world, is particularly sensitive. And if we move on to the next slide, I will briefly refer on what the data that I have gathered in terms of the outcome of the first round. And here I start talking about some of the what I have identified as the deal breakers. And one of the very clear ones, and Didier referred to it earlier, because Canada has had a very strong stance, a very strong position on this, is labor matters. And apparently the U.S. has put on the table a few things that Mexico and Canada clearly have said no. In particular, the U.S. wants to draft the agreement, and Canada and Mexico said no, we will each draft a part, which is, I believe, very reasonable. And in connection with the position of the U.S. for a salary homologation with Mexico and to have a U.S. unions active in Mexico, that's a real deal breaker for Mexico because, I mean, if you think of it, I mean, the size of the economies itself is, dramatically different. I mean, the hourly rate that an employee in Mexico makes in the automotive industry is probably $3, while in the U.S. is probably 3 times more. And trying for the politicians to interfere in the business approach, and don't get me wrong, I'm all pro to have the Mexican workers get better paid and better benefits, but it will not be realistic. And if the U.S. insists on having Mexico increase the levels of their salary and bonuses and make it comparable to the U.S., it will be unreasonable. Mexico will lose competitiveness, and it will be a position for a deal breaker. Something else that has been on the table and has been discussed is that if the U.S. initiates the termination process, Mexico just stops negotiating and leaves the negotiating table, which is also very reasonable. You cannot be meeting, as Lighthizer said, among friends and have been constructing a very solid relationship among the negotiation partners, and then, go out to the newsstand and see a newspaper saying that, again, there's a new threat to abandon the agreement. So I believe that the message that we have been asking is one same line. We want one same language at any levels, not only from the negotiation standpoint, but also from the political standpoint. And if we address what has been happening in the last few days in Mexico, we know as a fact that 25 of the 30 tables met. As we said earlier in the presentation, the toughest topics have not been addressed yet. And one of the very important issues that I wanted to bring to the table is on the immigration position that the Mexican next door room has perceived in terms of the position of the U.S. in terms of immigration. And we believe it has to do with Hurricane Harvey, which, as you know, it has devastated Texas, which is very, very sad. But if you think of it, who will be key to rebuild Texas? And some of us that are very close to Texas and spend time there, I can tell you as a fact that the percentage of the Mexican workers and the Hispanic workers and the Central American workers involved in the construction in Texas is huge and will only increase as a result of this. So this is a new issue that has been having an impact in the negotiation and the approach, which eventually, and we don't know that, that's pure speculation, will have the U.S. to take a much, somehow of a more flexible stand in terms of the immigration process. And in terms of the worst case scenario, I believe that we leave that as part of the questions, Crystal, as we have agreed, because I'm sure that Didier and Brian would have a lot to say in that regards. And I'll pass it on to you, Brian, for the next slide.
Hugo, that sounded very reasonable and very good. The idea that the negotiations and the way they're viewed should not be politicized. They have been here in the United States, I have to say. However, they were a major topic during the course of the campaign, repeatedly a subject of campaign rhetoric. And a thing that concerns me is that the president may have, through a number of the statements that have been made, placed himself in an uncomfortable corner where now his supporters are going to be looking for how he delivers on those campaign promises. And you mentioned the wall. I think that we can maybe separate that, hopefully, from NAFTA, from the technical topics regarding trade, because I don't know how that one is actually resolvable, given some of the statements that were made. But I think that at least in the United States, to satisfy his base, he's going to need to come back with a way to show that, based on his background in being able to do deals and negotiations and taking a much harder line, as he's promised, that somehow he's come out ahead in the negotiations. Maybe he'll change the rhetoric as that goes forward and suddenly say that this is a good deal and this is a great deal. But there's obviously a disconnect in that would result from that in the rhetoric. So I think in order for there to be a deal breaker, it would have to be some way that he cannot come back and say that the deal will decrease the U.S. trade deficit in some explainable way, will increase U.S. manufacturing employment, in some vague way level the playing field, and provide him for a way to say that the U.S. has not given up anything. I mean, if you proceed from the basis that words have meaning and that promises are going to be kept, then those are the things that would have to, he'd at least have to be able to say those things. Whether that's something that would be desirable from a negotiating prospect or not. So I think that if the U.S. negotiators end up being placed in a position where they can say, we came back with these benefits from negotiations, where somehow we believe that this is going to result in a decrease in the trade deficit, particularly with Mexico, and there's going to be some sort of corresponding increase in U.S. manufacturing employment, that it will be successful. Otherwise, I think it'll have some difficulty.
Okay. Very interesting. And one question that I would like to open up to Brian and Didier: how do you perceive, if we're talking about, as you say, Brian, the relationship between politics and trade, the relationship between the U.S. and Canadian politicians with the different trade industries, with corporate America, with corporate Canada? Are they on the same page, or are each of your governments, perceiving some sort of internal stress between the pressures that they might be receiving from some chambers of commerce and their political interest?
Well, in Canada, there is exceptionally unanimity between industry, the government, and because we are a parliamentary system, modeled on Great Britain, the opposition party. The opposition, even today, issued saying we will not be questioning our government strategy in the NAFTA negotiations. There is a very rare national interest coalition behind what the government has done, and beyond the rhetoric, the Canadian government hasn't been answering to the rhetoric. It has, however, been building bridges with Congress, with governors. Canada is the first trading partner of 35 of the 48 continental states. And so linkages have been being created between various government ministries, with governors, with industry in the United States, as being the primary client for all these states, to making sure that there are other pressure points on the administration to bring this forward and to preserve what has been a very, very good deal for the continent.
Okay, very, very interesting. Didier, what is your perception from the U.S., Brian?
I think it really depends on what industry you're talking about. So whether that industry is on the same side as the U.S. negotiators. I think in general there's a great deal of concern. But I would take as an example the auto industry, and we've referred to it in the past, earlier in the presentation. The huge volume of trade in parts and components and completed vehicles between the three nations. You imagine yourself inside one of these auto companies dealing with these very, very sophisticated and complex rules of origin. and the stakes that are involved in the billions and billions of dollars worth of merchandise crossing borders, and the difficulty in planning and keeping up with compliance in those areas, and against the stakes of losing that duty-free treatment and having perhaps duties reimposed on parts, components, and so forth, and affecting the supply chain. I mean, nobody in the auto industry wants that. So when we hear, for instance, discussion as came up last week of national origin as opposed to regional origin being significant, or having a dramatic increase in the regional value content calculation requirements for NAFTA eligibility, the auto industry doesn't want that. Now, if you look, for instance, perhaps at the steel industry, there are individual companies within the steel industry that may be more supportive of this, or there may be support. In fact, there is support within the unions. But in general, I would say that particularly with some aspects of the negotiations, the modernization, things of that nature, I think you can find support in this industry. But with regard to tightening up the rules of origin or increasing national content requirements, I do not think that there is much support out there.
Yeah, what I perceive is that the Canadian and the Mexican perspective is somehow similar. Exceptionally, the government and the industries are apparently united on the terms and position of the negotiation, but apparently, as Brian's saying, it's not the case in the U.S. And this comments of Didier and Brian led me to open up the conclusions, and I'll start with mine. I'll pass it on to Didier and Brian to leave 5 minutes for the questions that Crystal will coordinate. My conclusion is that we, in our positions, and to distribute and to share the information with our clients, we need to support NAFTA because the region will only be stronger if we keep doing what we're doing. We need to modernize it. It's a 23-year-old agreement, but the worst case scenario would be that a trade war will start among our countries. And of course we have WTO rules and stuff, but hopefully that will not be necessary. And I'm really hopeful that at the end of the day reason will prevail and the trade interest and the negotiation position of the countries will be on a win-win strategy. And I'll pass it on to Didier and to Brian for their conclusions.
Well, it has served the continent very well for the past 23 years. I think everyone is in agreement that it needs a modernizing. There's some political rhetoric which takes up a lot of room in terms of noise, but it doesn't necessarily bode out by the numbers. Nor, I don't think, has anyone really done the impact analysis of what all this would look like if NAFTA was torn up, and which gets to another question in terms of that background noise: is can the president just tear up NAFTA on his own, or does he need to have a bill passed through Congress? And what are the chances of doing that? Because NAFTA was enacted by an act of Congress. So I think there's a number of issues out there.
Yes, he can withdraw. Unfortunately, I mean that question as to whether he can withdraw has pretty much been answered. There would be plenty of court cases around the supporting legislation and so forth, but it was an executive agreement, so he actually can withdraw.
Well, there you go.
Unfortunately.
And so there we'll have to see how this all plays itself out, but I think it would be quite devastating for the North American economy.
Okay. And what are your conclusions, Brian?
I think there's absolutely no doubt that it's been a great benefit to the North American region. I think that In the United States, there have been obviously industries that have seen decreases in employment, decreases in investment. But I think that what we've seen in those terms is actually much less than what we would have seen if NAFTA had not been in place to aid the competitiveness of the U.S. and the North American region vis-a-vis Asia. And I'm hopeful that it will be resolved and that the negotiations come to a successful conclusion. I'm rather concerned about the delay of some of the more complex issues to the end of the negotiations, because to me, to work through things like the rules of origin on an individual product-by-product basis is something that can be very, very time-consuming. Mm-hmm. But hopefully they can come to agreement.
Well, Brian, Didier, thank you very much. I believe that having the opportunity to hear the perspective of the three countries on NAFTA is a rare opportunity, which I really hope that the participants have enjoyed. And by this, I will turn it on to Crystal for coordination of the questions, and if you will be kind enough to read them for us in the 3 minutes that we have left, Crystal.
Certainly. That was wonderful, guys. Thank you so much. The only one that came in quite a bit ago, we may have covered it a little bit, but if anybody wants to go more in depth on what is the worst case scenario?
Well, I'll tell you from the Mexico perspective, I'll use a minute of the 3 left on that. I mean, the worst case scenario is that NAFTA is terminated and that Mexico will have to use the WTO rules. An example, for Mexico, 37% of the exports of Mexico go to the United States. So we will have a significant impact, but it's not the end of the world, because the tariffs that are used in the World Trade Organization deal that we have with the United States are anywhere between 3 and 4%. So this will be particularly sensitive for the industries with a very, very low margin. But for the rest of the industries, 3 or 4%, it is anticipated that it can be overtaken. And the rest of the exports go to the other 45 countries that Mexico has free trade agreements with. But the worst case scenario is that we start operating under WTO rules, and more than anything, that a trade war is initiated. Brian?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, the loss of preferential treatment to the industries in all 3 countries would dramatically increase costs. Frankly, I think it would probably end up with a loss of employment in all 3 countries as trade had to readjust itself, because there would be reallocation of resources that would be necessary on a very fast turnaround basis. We'd have increased costs to consumers. It would be very, very, very disruptive for all 3 economies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brian. Didier, what do you think the worst case scenario would be?
Well, obviously, the worst case scenario is a catastrophe for, at the end of the day, consumers, and they, the middle class, and those who are on tight economies, because yes, the WTO tariffs are probably very low, but those tariffs are going to be those costs are going to be passed on to the consumer. So you're going to create inflation in your marketplace. You're going to create a situation where consumers can't have access to this. Some of the merchandise that they're used to getting to. I have a tough time seeing the upside. And then there's a question that's being asked over here in Canada, where if NAFTA's torn up, well, NAFTA didn't abolish the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. All it did was supersede it. So it's still out there. And what role does it play if NAFTA doesn't exist? So that's kind of like a question that's kind of out there, and will really depend on on what is the motivation at the White House and at the USTR.
Well, guys, thank you very much. It's 2 o'clock. We have used our time. Didier, Brian, thank you very much for your presentation. Crystal, thank you for putting it up. And thank you specifically to all of the attendees, and I hope that you have found this webinar of interest. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Didier. Thank you, Brian. That was really wonderful. I just want to take 1 second and remind everybody that after the webinar in the next few days, I will distribute a copy of the presentation or recording of the webinar, as well as everybody's contact details. So if anything comes up in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to the presenters directly or to me if there's anything that I can do to help. With that, thank you again. Thanks for joining us, and I hope everybody has a great day. Bye.
All right, bye-bye.